Sometimes a man spends so long running from his past that he forgets he's been searching for his future. For 20 years, Hollis Vane had walked these Sierra Nevada mountains with only his dog Juniper for company, believing he'd found all the peace the world had to offer. Then they discovered the Redwood, with a door carved into its ancient bark. Inside wasn't just shelter from the winter storm. It was a home filled with old books and stranger things, tended by a silver-haired man who spoke of forgotten histories. The tree held secrets that stretched back centuries, and somehow Hollis realized his own story was written somewhere in those dusty journals. The old keeper offered him a choice that would change everything. But the real question wasn't about staying or leaving. What was Hollis truly meant to find in that ancient tree? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Sierra Nevada peaks like memories refusing to fade, and Hollis Vane breathed in the crisp December air as he had every morning for 2 decades. His weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, steam rising in delicate spirals that disappeared into the grey dawn. At 62, his face bore the deep lines of a man who had spent more years squinting into mountain sun than most folks spent indoors. But his eyes still held the sharp clarity of someone who had learned to read the language of the wilderness. Juniper, his 8-year-old German Shepherd mix, stretched beside the cabin's stone steps and yawned with the casual confidence of a dog who knew every trail, every scent, every sound within a 50-mile radius. Her coat had begun to show threads of silver around her muzzle, matching the grey that had crept into Hollis's own dark beard. They had grown old together in these mountains, and there was a comfortable rhythm to their mornings that spoke of deep companionship born from shared solitude. The cabin itself was a testament to patient craftsmanship and practical living. Hollis had built it log by log during his first 5 years in the mountains, using timber from trees that had fallen naturally and stones gathered from the creek bed that wound through the valley below. The structure sat on a natural shelf of granite, positioned to catch the morning sun and shelter from the prevailing winds that swept down from the higher peaks. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves holding books on forestry, geology, and wildlife management, alongside volumes of poetry and philosophy that had helped him make sense of his exile from the world below. 20 years ago, Hollis had been Lieutenant Colonel Hollis Vane, United States Army Corps of Engineers, a man responsible for building bridges and roads that would last generations. He had overseen construction projects across 3 continents, managed teams of hundreds, and earned commendations that now gathered dust in a footlocker beneath his bed. The transition from commanding officer to mountain hermit hadn't been planned. It had been necessary. The incident that changed everything happened on a foggy morning in Afghanistan. A miscommunication, a delayed convoy, and a bridge that couldn't bear the weight it was supposed to carry. 7 good soldiers died because of calculations that were wrong by mere inches, measurements that Hollis had personally verified, but that somehow failed when it mattered most. The military inquiry cleared him of wrongdoing, but Hollis knew the truth that lived in the space between official reports and sleepless nights. He had made an error in judgment, trusted data that should have been double-checked, and good men paid the price, so he had walked away from everything, the career, the pension, the life he had built, and driven north until the roads ended and the mountains began. He purchased 40 acres of remote land with his savings, filed the necessary permits for a permanent residence, and began the long process of learning to live with himself again. The mountains had been patient teachers. They demanded respect, but offered solace, challenged him daily, but never judged his past failures. Over the years, Hollis had become something of a local legend among the few scattered residents of the high country. Rangers would occasionally stop by to check on him, and he had helped coordinate search and rescue operations for lost hikers more than once. His engineering background proved useful in unexpected ways, helping neighbors solve water problems, reinforcing structures against heavy snow loads, and reading the subtle signs that warned of avalanche danger. But for all his usefulness to others, Hollis lived primarily for the simple rhythms of survival and solitude. He maintained a large garden during the growing season, preserved food for winter, and supplemented his stores with careful hunting and fishing. The nearest town was a 2-hour hike, followed by an hour's drive on winding mountain roads. A journey he made perhaps once a month for supplies and mail. This particular December morning felt different, though Hollis couldn't quite place why. The air carried an unusual stillness, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Even Juniper seemed more alert than usual, her ears pricked forward and her nose testing the wind with unusual intensity. Snow had fallen heavily the night before, blanketing the landscape in pristine white that muffled all sound, except the distant murmur of the creek and the occasional crack of a tree branch adjusting to winter's weight. Hollis finished his coffee and stepped back inside to check his supplies. The weather forecast called for another significant storm system to move through over the next few days, and he wanted to ensure his firewood was properly stocked and his emergency provisions were in order. He had learned long ago that mountain winters demanded meticulous preparation and respect for nature's power to transform familiar landscapes into alien territories. The interior of his cabin reflected the methodical mind of an engineer adapted to wilderness living. Tools hung in precise arrangements on pegboards, canned goods were organized by type and date, and maps of the surrounding terrain were pinned to one wall with hiking routes marked in different colored pencils. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, its hearth blackened by countless evenings of warmth and contemplation. Books filled every available surface, guides to edible plants, technical manuals for small engines, novels that transported him to other worlds when the isolation grew too heavy. On his desk sat a leather-bound journal where he recorded daily observations about weather patterns, wildlife movements, and seasonal changes. After 20 years, these journals formed a comprehensive record of the mountain's moods and rhythms, data that local researchers occasionally requested for their studies on climate patterns and ecosystem health. Writing in the journal had also become a form of meditation for Hollis, a way of processing thoughts and emotions that had no other outlet in his solitary life. As he prepared for the day's activities, Hollis reflected on how completely his life had changed since leaving the army. The sea man who once briefed generals and managed million-dollar projects now found deep satisfaction in splitting firewood and tracking deer sign through fresh snow. He had discovered that competence could be rebuilt even after devastating failure, that useful skills could be learned at any age, and that peace sometimes required retreating from the world that had wounded you. Juniper's sudden bark broke him from his reverie. She stood at the door, tail rigid and ears forward, staring toward the tree line beyond the cabin's clearing. Hollis grabbed his heavy coat and boots, stepping outside to see what had captured her attention. The dog rarely alerted to ordinary wildlife. She had long since grown accustomed to the deer, bears, and smaller creatures that shared their territory. The snow continued to fall in large, lazy flakes that caught the morning light like tiny prisms. Visibility was limited to perhaps 100 yards in any direction, and the silence was so complete that Hollis could hear his own heartbeat. He followed Juniper's gaze toward the dense stand of old-growth redwoods that marked the eastern boundary of his property, but saw nothing unusual among the massive trunks that disappeared into the gray morning mist. Still, something felt different about this day. Perhaps it was the particular quality of the light, or the way the snow seemed to muffle even the smallest sounds. But Hollis sensed that the mountains were about to show him something new. After 20 years of careful observation, he had learned to trust these subtle intuitions about the natural world around him. He gathered his day pack, filled it with emergency supplies, and called Juniper to his side. If the weather was going to worsen as predicted, this might be his last opportunity for several days to check the boundary markers and ensure that his winter preparations were complete. The dog fell into step beside him as they set off toward the eastern tree line, her nose working constantly as she processed the complex symphony of scents that filled the winter air. Neither of them suspected that this routine morning patrol would lead them to a discovery that would transform everything. Hollis thought he knew about the land he had called home for 2 decades. The mountains, patient as always, were finally ready to reveal one of their most carefully guarded secrets. The Redwood Grove stretched before them like a natural cathedral, its towering pillars disappearing into the grey mist above. These ancient giants had stood for over 1,000 years, their massive trunks scarred by fires that had swept through the mountains in centuries past. Yet they endured with the quiet dignity of beings that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless generations. Hollis had walked among them hundreds of times, finding solace in their timeless presence whenever the weight of solitude grew too heavy. But today, something was different. Juniper stopped abruptly 30 yards into the grove, her body going rigid in the alert stance that signaled genuine alarm. Her hackles rose slightly, and a low whine escaped her throat. Not fear exactly, but profound uncertainty about something that challenged her understanding of familiar territory. In all their years together, Hollis had never seen her react this way to anything in these woods. "What is it, girl?" he whispered, though the question was more for himself than for the dog. The snow had been falling steadily for hours, creating a muffled silence that seemed to amplify every small sound. Yet as they stood there listening, Hollis became aware of something he had never noticed before in this place, a subtle humming, barely perceptible, like the sound of distant machinery, or perhaps wind moving through a structure he couldn't see. Juniper took a tentative step forward, then looked back at Hollis with an expression that seemed to ask for guidance. He had learned to trust her instincts completely over the years, knowing that her senses could detect things that remained invisible to human perception. If she was uncertain, there was genuine reason for caution. They moved deeper into the grove, following a familiar game trail that wound between the massive trunks. The redwoods here were among the largest Hollis had ever seen, some measuring more than 20 feet in diameter and rising to heights that vanished in the low-hanging clouds. Their bark was deeply furrowed and had a reddish hue that seemed to glow softly in the diffused morning light. It was the glow that Hollis noticed first. About 100 yards ahead, filtered through the falling snow and morning mist, he could see what appeared to be a warm, golden light emanating from somewhere among the trees. At first, he assumed it was simply sunlight breaking through the cloud cover, but as they approached, it became clear that the illumination was coming from ground level and had a steady, artificial quality that natural light never possessed. Juniper's whining grew more pronounced, but she continued forward with the determination of a dog, following a scent trail that both intrigued and worried her. Hollis found himself moving more carefully, placing each step with the deliberate caution he had learned during his military service when approaching potentially dangerous situations. The source of the light revealed itself gradually as they drew closer. It was coming from what appeared to be a door, an actual wooden door, set directly into the trunk of one of the largest redwoods in the grove. The door was clearly handmade, constructed from what looked like the same reddish wood as the tree itself, with intricate carvings that depicted scenes of natural life, deer drinking from streams, eagles soaring above mountain peaks, and human figures that seemed to be engaged in various forms of work and celebration. But it was impossible. Hollis had passed this exact tree dozens of times over the years. He was certain of it. The distinctive branching pattern, the particular scarring from an old lightning strike, the moss formations, all of it was familiar. Yet there had never been a door here before. The golden light seeped around the edges of the doorframe and through what appeared to be a small window set into its upper portion. The illumination had a warmth that seemed to push back against the cold mountain air, creating a small zone of relative comfort in the snow-filled grove. As they stood there, staring at something that defied rational explanation, the door began to open. It moved slowly, with the careful deliberation of someone who had sensed their approach and was choosing to reveal himself rather than remain hidden. The hinges made no sound, despite the door's obvious age and the weather conditions that should have caused wood and metal to protest any movement. A figure appeared in the doorway, an elderly man with silver hair that reached his shoulders and a beard that was even longer and more flowing than Hollis's own. His clothes were simple but well made, consisting of wool pants, a heavy cotton shirt, and a vest that appeared to be crafted from leather that had been worked until it was as soft as cloth. But it was his eyes that captured Hollis's attention immediately. They were pale blue, almost grey, and held a depth that spoke of decades, perhaps centuries, of accumulated wisdom and careful observation. The man stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying Hollis and Juniper with the same careful attention they were giving him. His expression was neither welcoming nor hostile, but rather seemed to be making some kind of assessment about their character and intentions. "I have been waiting for you," the old man said finally, his voice carrying clearly through the falling snow despite its soft, measured tone. "Though perhaps not as long as I have waited for others." Hollis felt his mouth go dry. Nothing about this situation made sense according to any framework of reality he understood. A door in a tree trunk, a man living inside a redwood, the implication that their meeting had been somehow anticipated. All of it challenged the rational, engineering-trained mind that had guided him through 6 decades of life. "I don't understand," Hollis managed to say. "I've walked through these woods for 20 years. This door, none of this was here before." The old man smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered features into something almost grandfatherly. "Time moves differently here than it does in your world below. Things become visible when they choose to be seen, or when the person walking among these trees is ready to see them. Today, apparently, you are ready." Juniper whined again, but this time the sound carried less uncertainty and more curiosity. Her tail gave a tentative wag, as if she had decided that whatever this situation represented, it was more interesting than threatening. "My name is Ezra," the old man continued. "I am what you might call a keeper of this place, though that title doesn't really capture the full scope of what I do here. Would you like to come inside? The storm is going to intensify soon, and there are things I believe you need to see." The rational part of Hollis's mind screamed warnings about the impossibility of what he was experiencing. Engineers dealt in measurable quantities, in cause and effect, in phenomena that could be explained through scientific principles. A man living inside a tree trunk was not scientifically possible. A door that appeared and disappeared contradicted everything he understood about the physical world, but another part of him, a part that had been awakened by 20 years of mountain solitude and daily communion with forces larger than human comprehension, recognized that he stood at a threshold between the world he had known and something entirely new. The same intuition that had guided him through wilderness survival, that had taught him to read weather patterns and animal behavior, now told him that this moment was significant beyond anything he could currently understand. "I think," Hollis said slowly, looking down at Juniper and then back at the impossible man in the impossible doorway, "that we would very much like to come inside." Ezra stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. As Hollis approached the threshold, he could feel warmth radiating from within the tree, along with the scent of wood smoke, old books, and something else he couldn't quite identify, something that reminded him of libraries and workshops and places where important work was done. He paused at the threshold, looking back once at the familiar world of snow and ancient trees that had been his reality for 2 decades. Then he stepped forward into the warm golden light, with Juniper close beside him, crossing from everything he had known into something that would change his understanding of the world forever. The interior of the redwood defied every law of physics Hollis thought he understood. What should have been a cramped hollow within the tree's trunk opened into a spacious room that seemed far larger than the circumference of even the massive redwood could contain. The ceiling stretched high above, supported by living wood that curved and branched in organic patterns, while the walls glowed with the same warm golden light that had drawn them through the snow. Juniper padded across the threshold without hesitation, her usual caution abandoned in favor of intense curiosity. She immediately began investigating the space with her nose, her tail wagging as she discovered scents that apparently fascinated rather than alarmed her. Whatever this place was, it passed her instinctive tests for safety and welcome. "How is this possible?" Hollis whispered, turning slowly to take in the impossible architecture surrounding them. Ezra closed the door behind them with a soft click that seemed to seal them away from the winter storm completely. The sounds of wind and falling snow vanished, replaced by the gentle crackling of a fire somewhere deeper in the space and the subtle creaking of living wood, adjusting to accommodate its unusual residence. "Possibility," Ezra said, hanging his heavy coat on a peg carved directly from the wall, "is a much more flexible concept than most people realize. The world you know below operates according to certain rules, but those rules are not universal. Here, in places where the old knowledge still holds sway, different principles apply." The room was furnished with handcrafted pieces that seemed to have grown from the wood itself, rather than being constructed from separate materials. Chairs carved from burled redwood held cushions woven from wool in natural colors. Tables formed from cross-sections of massive branches displayed books, instruments, and artifacts that Hollis couldn't immediately identify. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with volumes bound in leather, cloth, and materials he didn't recognize. But it was the books themselves that drew his attention most powerfully. Even from across the room, he could see that many of them were ancient. Not just old, but truly ancient, with bindings that suggested they had been created centuries or even millennia ago. The titles visible on their spines were written in scripts he couldn't read, languages that seemed to predate anything he had encountered in his education or military service. "What is this place?" he asked, his engineer's mind still struggling to process the spatial impossibility of the room's dimensions. "This is a repository," Ezra replied, moving to tend a fire that burned in a hearth carved from the living wall, one of several dozen that were established long ago to preserve knowledge that the outside world was in danger of losing. Books, records, maps, techniques, stories, anything that seemed important enough to save for future generations. Hollis approached one of the shelves, drawn by volumes that seemed to call out for examination. Up close, he could see that the collection was far more diverse than he had initially realized. Ancient texts set beside relatively modern scientific journals, hand-copied manuscripts shared space with printed books. Maps drawn on materials he couldn't identify were rolled and stored in specially crafted wooden tubes. "How long have you been here?" he asked, running his fingers along the spine of a book written in what appeared to be Latin. "Time moves differently in this place," Ezra said, echoing his earlier comment. "I have been the keeper of this repository for what feels like a very long time, but measuring that duration in years or decades would be meaningless. When I first accepted this responsibility, there were still passenger pigeons in your forests and buffalo covered your great plains. Does that help you understand the scope of what we're discussing?" Hollis felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather outside. If Ezra was telling the truth, he had been serving as keeper for well over a century, which should have been impossible for any human being. Yet the man before him, while clearly elderly, showed no signs of the extreme frailty that would be expected of someone who had lived for more than 100 years. "That's impossible," Hollis said, though even as he spoke the words, he realized how foolish they sounded in this context. Is it more impossible than a room that exists in a space larger than its container? Ezra asked with gentle humor. Or a door that appears only when someone is ready to see it? You've already accepted several impossibilities this morning, Mr. Vane. What's one more? The casual use of his name caught Hollis off guard. How do you know who I am? I know a great deal about you, Ezra replied, settling into one of the carved chairs with the careful movements of someone whose body carried the weight of accumulated years. I know about your service in the Army Corps of Engineers. I know about the bridge in Afghanistan and the 7 soldiers who died because of a miscalculation that haunts you still. I know about the 20 years you've spent in these mountains, punishing yourself for a mistake that was as much about impossible circumstances as it was about human error. Hollis felt his knees go weak. The details of the Afghanistan incident were classified, known only to a handful of military personnel and investigators. The psychological aftermath, the self-imposed exile, the daily struggle with guilt and responsibility, these were private matters he had never discussed with anyone. How could you possibly know about that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because, Ezra said gently, part of my responsibility as keeper involves understanding the people who are drawn to this place. You didn't find this door by accident, Mr. Vane. You've been walking these woods for 20 years, and the door has been here all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. That moment came today because you're finally ready to confront some truths about yourself and your place in a larger story. Juniper had completed her initial exploration and now sat beside Hollis, pressing against his leg in the way she always did when she sensed his distress. Her presence was grounding, a reminder that whatever impossible circumstances he found himself in, some constants remained reliable. I don't understand any of this, Hollis said, though he was beginning to suspect that understanding might not be the most important requirement for whatever was happening to him. Understanding will come, Ezra assured him. For now, it's enough that you're here and that you're willing to listen. There are things I need to show you, stories I need to tell you, and choices you'll need to make. But first, you should know that your arrival here is not just significant. For you, it's significant for the preservation of knowledge that could be lost forever if certain events are allowed to unfold as they currently appear to be heading. The weight of implication in Ezra's words settled over Hollis like a heavy cloak. Whatever this place was, whatever impossible realities it represented, it seemed that his presence here was connected to something much larger than his personal journey of healing and self-discovery. What kind of knowledge? He asked, though part of him wasn't certain he was ready for the answer. Ezra smiled, but there was a sadness in the expression that spoke of burdens carried for far too long in solitude. The kind that could change how humanity understands its relationship with the natural world, he said. The kind that powerful people would kill to possess or destroy. The kind that you, with your particular combination of skills and experience, might be uniquely qualified to help preserve. Ezra rose from his chair with deliberate care and moved to a section of shelving that held what appeared to be maps and charts. He selected a large, rolled document and carried it to a table near the center of the room, gesturing for Hollis to join him as he carefully unrolled the ancient parchment. The map that revealed itself was unlike anything Hollis had ever seen. It depicted the Sierra Nevada mountain range in extraordinary detail, but included geographical features that didn't exist on any modern survey. Hidden valleys, underground waterways, and structures that appeared to be built into mountainsides were marked with symbols and notations in multiple languages and scripts. This is a map of the true geography of these mountains, Ezra explained, his finger tracing routes that wound between familiar peaks and through valleys Hollis didn't recognize. It shows not just the physical features that your modern cartographers record, but also the hidden places where knowledge has been preserved, where the old ways are still practiced, where the boundary between your everyday world and deeper realities grows thin. Hollis studied the map with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades reading topographical surveys and engineering blueprints. The technical quality of the cartography was exceptional, with elevation markings, watershed boundaries, and geological formations rendered in precise detail. But scattered throughout the familiar landscape were dozens of symbols marking locations that he was certain didn't exist. These places, he said, pointing to a cluster of symbols near what he recognized as his own valley. I've hiked every trail in this region. I've never seen anything like what's marked here, because you weren't ready to see them, Ezra replied. Or perhaps because the time wasn't right for them to reveal themselves. The world contains far more mysteries than most people suspect. Mr. Vane, your scientific training has taught you to trust only what can be measured and verified, but there are forms of knowledge that operate according to different principles. The artifact that dominated this section of the repository was a device that Hollis couldn't immediately categorize. It sat on a pedestal near the map table, constructed from what appeared to be a combination of polished wood, worked metal, and crystalline components that caught and reflected the golden light in complex patterns. Gears and mechanisms were visible through openings in its casing, but their purpose wasn't obvious to someone trained in conventional engineering. "What is that?" Hollis asked, drawn to examine the device more closely. "A knowledge compass," Ezra explained. It was created by craftsmen who understood that information, like magnetic force, has directional properties. It can locate repositories of preserved knowledge, identify threats to that knowledge, and sometimes, under the right circumstances, reveal connections between past events and future possibilities. As Hollis leaned in to study the device, its crystalline components began to glow more brightly, and he could hear the subtle sound of internal mechanisms beginning to move. The effect was both fascinating and unsettling, suggesting that the device was somehow responding to his presence. "It's reacting to you," Ezra observed with interest. "That's unusual. The compass typically requires specific activation procedures before it will respond to anyone other than the repository's keeper." "What does that mean?" Hollis asked, though he suspected the answer would be another piece of impossible information that challenged his understanding of reality. "It means," Ezra said carefully, "that you have a stronger connection to this place and its purposes than either of us realized. The compass recognizes something in you that qualifies you as more than just a visitor." Before Hollis could respond, the device emitted a soft chiming sound, and a series of symbols began to appear on its surface, not carved or printed, but somehow manifesting from within the crystalline components themselves. The symbols pulsed with light in sequence, creating patterns that seemed almost like a form of communication. "What is it telling us?" Hollis asked, mesmerized by the display. Ezra frowned as he studied the symbols, his expression growing more concerned with each passing moment. "It's detecting a threat," he said finally. "Something that endangers not just this repository, but the entire network of knowledge preservation sites throughout the region." The implications of this statement sent a chill through Hollis that had nothing to do with the winter weather outside. The idea that there were multiple sites like this one, hidden throughout the mountains he had called home for 20 years, was staggering enough. But the suggestion that they were all under some form of threat raised questions that he wasn't certain he was prepared to confront. "What kind of threat?" he asked. "The kind that has been growing in power and influence for decades," Ezra replied, his voice heavy with the weight of long-held fears finally being voiced. "There are people in your world below who have become aware of places like this one. They don't understand what we preserve here, but they know it represents forms of knowledge and power that they want to control or destroy." Juniper, who had been exploring the repository with calm curiosity, suddenly lifted her head and began to growl low in her throat. Her attention was focused on the door they had entered through, and her body language suggested she was detecting something outside that concerned her. "What is it, girl?" Hollis asked, moving to where she stood. Ezra was already extinguishing the fire in the hearth and moving to dim the golden lights that illuminated the repository. "Someone is approaching through the grove," he said quietly. "Someone who shouldn't be able to find this place unless they have assistance from people who understand how to breach the protections that keep us hidden." The knowledge compass continued to chime softly, its symbols now pulsing in urgent red patterns that needed no translation to communicate alarm. Outside, barely audible through the thick walls of the living tree, came the sound of voices and movement through the snow-covered forest. Who could it be? Hollis whispered, though part of him already suspected the answer wouldn't be reassuring. Representatives of the threat I mentioned, Ezra replied, moving to a section of the repository where more unusual devices were stored. People who have been searching for places like this one for years, and who have finally developed the means to locate them. Your arrival here today may not have been the coincidence I thought it was. It may have been the trigger that revealed our location to those who would destroy what we've spent centuries preserving. The weight of responsibility settled over Hollis like a crushing load. In coming here, in crossing the threshold from his familiar world into this repository of ancient knowledge, he might have inadvertently endangered something precious beyond measure. The guilt and self-recrimination that had driven him into the mountains 20 years ago threatened to overwhelm him again. But this time, the stakes seemed infinitely higher than a single military operation gone wrong. "What do we do?" he asked, looking to Ezra for guidance while simultaneously preparing himself for the possibility that his newfound understanding of the world was about to be put to a test he wasn't certain he was ready to face. Ezra moved with surprising speed for a man of his apparent age, gathering items from various locations throughout the repository with the practiced efficiency of someone who had prepared for this possibility many times before. From a cabinet carved into the living wall, he retrieved what appeared to be a journal bound in dark leather, its pages thick with handwritten notes and diagrams. This was clearly something important, a record that couldn't be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. "The Chronicle of Keepers," he explained tersely, securing the journal in a waterproof pouch. "If something happens to me, this contains the locations of all the other repositories, along with the protocols for contacting their keepers. You'll need it to warn them about what's happening here." "Why me?" Hollis asked, though he was already moving to help gather whatever items Ezra deemed essential. 20 years of mountain living had taught him to respond quickly to emergencies, even when he didn't fully understand their nature. "Because," Ezra said, pulling a canvas bag from beneath one of the tables, "you're the first person in 50 years to find this place, and that doesn't happen by accident. The repositories choose their own successors. Mr. Vane, the knowledge compass recognized you for a reason." Outside, the voices were growing closer, accompanied by the distinctive sound of multiple people moving through deep snow with purpose rather than casual exploration. Juniper's growling had intensified, and she positioned herself between the door and the two men, her protective instincts fully engaged. The Chronicle of Keepers, Hollis realized, was the central artifact of this chapter of their story. As Ezra pressed the waterproof pouch into his hands, he could feel the weight of centuries of accumulated knowledge and responsibility. This wasn't just a book. It was a lifeline connecting dozens of hidden sanctuaries scattered throughout the Mountain West, each one preserving pieces of wisdom that the modern world had forgotten or discarded. "Listen carefully," Ezra said, his voice taking on the urgency of a man running out of time. "There's a passage that leads deeper into the mountain, beyond this chamber. If we're discovered here, I want you to take Juniper and follow that passage to its end. You'll find yourself in a cave system that connects to several valleys north of here. The Chronicle contains maps that will guide you to the next repository. What about you?" Hollis asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I've been keeper of this place for more than a century," Ezra replied with calm resignation. "My responsibility is to the knowledge preserved here, not to my own survival. If these people have come to destroy what we've protected, then someone needs to stay behind to ensure they understand the true scope of what they're attempting to eliminate." The voices outside had stopped, suggesting that whoever was approaching had reached the grove where the Redwood stood. In the silence that followed, Hollis could hear the subtle sounds of people spreading out, taking positions around the massive tree. These weren't casual hikers or lost tourists. They moved with the tactical discipline of individuals trained for coordinated operations. "How many?" Ezra whispered, though his questions seemed to be directed at the knowledge compass rather than at Hollis. The device responded by projecting a series of light patterns onto the ceiling of the repository, creating what appeared to be a tactical map of the surrounding area. Red points of light indicated the positions of at least 8 individuals, arranged in a rough circle around the tree. 2 additional signals showed movement along the trail they had followed into the grove, suggesting that reinforcements were still arriving. Military or paramilitary, Hollis observed, his training allowing him to read the tactical implications of the deployment pattern. They've established a perimeter before attempting entry. These people know what they're doing. Unfortunately, yes, Ezra agreed. The organization that employs them has been growing in influence for decades. They call themselves the Rationalist Collective, and they believe that any knowledge that can't be verified through conventional scientific methods represents a threat to human progress. They've been systematically locating and destroying repositories like this one for the past 20 years. The irony wasn't lost on Hollis that his own scientific training and rational worldview aligned closely with the philosophy Ezra was describing as threatening. Just hours earlier, he would have been skeptical of claims about ancient knowledge and mystical repositories hidden in trees. Now he found himself preparing to defend such a place against people who thought like he used to think. "Why now?" he asked. "What changed that allowed them to find this place?" "You did," Ezra said, though his tone held no accusation. "Your emotional state when you approached the grove this morning, the combination of long-held guilt, growing isolation, and unconscious readiness for transformation, created a resonance that temporarily weakened the protections around this repository. The collective has been monitoring the mountain regions with increasingly sophisticated equipment, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. The weight of responsibility threatened to overwhelm Hollis again, but Juniper's presence beside him provided an anchor to the immediate situation. Whatever mistakes he might have made, whatever consequences were unfolding because of his arrival here, the priority now was protecting the irreplaceable knowledge contained within these living walls. A sharp knock echoed through the repository as someone struck the outer door with what sounded like a metal tool. The sound was deliberately authoritative, designed to communicate that the people outside expected compliance rather than resistance. "Federal agents," a voice called through the door. "We have a warrant to search these premises for materials related to national security concerns. Open this door immediately." Ezra and Hollis exchanged glances. The claim of federal authority might be legitimate, but it could equally well be a deception designed to justify their actions to any witnesses who might later question what happened here. "They won't wait long," Ezra said quietly. "The door will hold against conventional tools, but if they've come prepared for this kind of operation, they'll have methods for breaching unconventional barriers." As if summoned by his words, the sound of machinery started up outside, something heavy and mechanical being positioned near the entrance to the repository. Whatever these people had brought with them, it was equipment designed for more than simple law enforcement activities. "Time to go," Ezra said, leading Hollis toward a section of the repository where the wall seemed to curve inward, creating what he now realized was the entrance to the passage the old man had mentioned. "Remember, the Chronicle contains everything you need to find the other keepers. Warn them about what's happening here, and help them prepare for similar attacks on their own repositories." The machine outside began to operate in earnest, producing vibrations that penetrated even the living walls of the ancient Redwood. Whatever the intruders were using, it was working to weaken the barriers that had protected this place for over a century. The passage behind the repository's main chamber was narrow and carved from living wood, its walls glowing with the same soft golden light that illuminated the larger space. As they moved deeper into the tree, Hollis could feel the vibrations from the machinery outside growing more intense, accompanied by the sound of voices coordinating what was clearly a sophisticated breaching operation. "How far does this passage go?" he asked, adjusting the straps of the pack that now carried the Chronicle of Keepers. and several other items Ezra had deemed essential for the preservation of the repository's most critical knowledge. About a quarter-mile through, the tree's root system, Ezra replied, moving with surprising agility despite his apparent age. It connects to a natural cave network that was here long before this redwood began growing. The original builders of the repository chose this location specifically because it provided multiple escape routes. Juniper padded alongside them, her ears constantly swiveling to monitor sounds from behind, while her nose worked to process the complex array of scents that filled the underground passage. She seemed to understand that they were fleeing from danger, and her entire body radiated the alert readiness of a dog prepared to defend her pack if necessary. Behind them, the sound of the machinery reached a crescendo, followed by a sharp crack that suggested the outer door had finally been breached. Voices echoed through the repository as the intruders began their systematic search of the main chamber. Their tone professional, but with an underlying note of excitement that spoke of people who had finally located something they had been seeking for a long time. "Move faster," Ezra urged, though he was already pushing the pace as much as his aging body would allow. "They'll discover the passage entrance within minutes." The tunnel began to slope downward more steeply, and the walls changed from living wood to natural stone as they transitioned from the tree's root system into the mountain's underground structure. The golden light that had guided them from the repository gradually faded, replaced by a different illumination that seemed to emanate from mineral deposits embedded in the cave walls. "Phosphorescent minerals," Hollis observed, his engineer's training automatically identifying the source of the light. "This whole cave system must be rich in naturally occurring luminescent compounds." "Knowledge takes many forms," Ezra replied, pausing to catch his breath as they reached a wider section of the tunnel. "Even the rocks here contain information, geological records that tell the story of how these mountains were formed, climatic data preserved in mineral deposits, chemical signatures that reveal the history of water flow and atmospheric conditions over millions of years." The concept that the mountains themselves were repositories of information resonated with something deep in Hollis's understanding of the natural world. During his 20 years of solitary living, he had learned to read the landscape in ways that went far beyond simple navigation, tracking weather patterns through cloud formations, understanding seasonal changes through subtle shifts in animal behavior, recognizing the stories that trees told through their growth patterns and scars. From the artifact he now carried, the Chronicle of Keepers seemed to pulse with warmth against his back, as if responding to their proximity to other sources of preserved knowledge. The journal represented not just a record of repository locations, but a living document that connected him to a network of guardians who had dedicated their lives to preserving wisdom that the modern world had forgotten. Behind them, the sound of pursuit had begun, voices calling to each other as the intruders discovered the passage and began to follow their trail. Flashlight beams occasionally flickered against the tunnel walls behind them, suggesting that their pursuers were moving quickly and with purpose. "They're gaining ground," Hollis observed, though he was careful to keep his voice low enough to avoid giving away their exact position. "They have younger legs than I do," Ezra admitted with grim humor. "But they don't know these tunnels the way I do. We have advantages they haven't anticipated." As if to demonstrate his point, Ezra led them through a series of turns that would have been impossible to navigate without intimate knowledge of the cave system. Side passages branched off in multiple directions, creating a maze that could easily confuse anyone unfamiliar with the underground geography. The phosphorescent minerals provided enough light to move safely, but not enough to make the correct path obvious to someone following behind them. "How many times have you used this escape route?" Hollis asked during a brief pause to listen for their pursuers. "More often than I would prefer," Ezra replied. "The Rationalist Collective has been growing more aggressive in their operations over the past decade. They've destroyed 3 repositories that I know of and attempted attacks on several others. Each time they succeed, they acquire more information about our network and our methods of protection. The implications of this ongoing campaign of destruction weighed heavily on Hollis's conscience. These repositories represented centuries of accumulated wisdom, irreplaceable knowledge that could never be recovered once it was lost. The idea that a systematic effort was underway to eliminate such places felt like a form of cultural vandalism on an enormous scale. What do they gain by destroying the repositories? He asked. Even if they don't believe in the value of the knowledge preserved there, why not simply ignore it? Because, Ezra said, his voice heavy with the weariness of someone who had contemplated this question many times, they understand that knowledge represents power, and they cannot tolerate the existence of power they cannot control. The repositories preserve ways of understanding the world that challenge the supremacy of conventional scientific materialism. To people who have built their careers and their worldview on the assumption that only measurable, repeatable phenomena are real, places like this represent an existential threat. The tunnel began to widen again, and Hollis could sense that they were approaching some kind of larger chamber. The air moved differently here, carrying scents of pine and snow that suggested proximity to the surface. After what felt like hours underground, but was probably only 30 or 40 minutes, they might finally be nearing an exit from the cave system. Almost there, Ezra confirmed, though his breathing had become more labored from the sustained exertion. The main exit opens into a valley about 3 miles north of where we started. From there, you'll be able to reach the next repository using the maps in the Chronicle. What about you? Hollis asked, though he suspected the answer hadn't changed during their underground journey. I'll be staying here, Ezra said with quiet determination. There are procedures I need to follow to ensure that critical knowledge doesn't fall into the wrong hands, even if they manage to breach the repository's deeper protections. The cave exit opened onto a snow-covered ledge overlooking a valley that Hollis had never seen before, despite 20 years of exploring what he thought was every accessible part of the surrounding terrain. The view stretched northward toward peaks that seemed familiar yet somehow different, as if he was seeing the landscape from an angle that revealed features previously hidden from his perspective. "This is impossible," he murmured, studying the geography spread out below them. "I know these mountains. This valley should be visible from the ridge behind my cabin, but I've never seen it before. Geography, like time, operates differently around the repositories," Ezra explained, breathing heavily from their underground journey. "The protections that hide these places extend beyond simple concealment spells. They actually fold space in ways that keep certain areas invisible to casual observation." Juniper emerged from the cave behind them, immediately alert to their new surroundings. Her nose worked constantly as she processed the wealth of scents carried on the mountain air, but her posture suggested curiosity rather than alarm. Whatever this hidden valley contained, it didn't trigger her protective instincts. As they stood on the ledge, catching their breath and planning their next move, the sound of voices echoed from within the cave system behind them. Their pursuers had successfully navigated the underground maze and were approaching the exit. The Rationalist Collective's agents were more resourceful than Ezra had hoped. "We need to move," Hollis said, scanning the terrain below for the best route down to the valley floor. But Ezra wasn't moving. Instead, he was studying Hollis with an expression that seemed to combine sadness, regret, and something that might have been relief. His entire demeanor had changed during their escape through the tunnels, as if reaching this particular location had triggered some kind of internal transformation. "There's something I need to tell you," Ezra said quietly. "Something about why you were really drawn to the repository today, and why the knowledge compass responded to you so strongly." The seriousness in his tone made Hollis pause, despite the urgency of their situation. "What are you talking about?" "My name isn't really Ezra," the old man said, his voice taking on a different quality, still aged, still weary, but somehow more familiar than it had been before. "I chose that identity when I accepted the role of repository keeper, but it wasn't the name I was born with." A chill ran down Hollis's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Something about the man's voice, about the way he was looking at him, triggered a recognition that his conscious mind couldn't quite grasp, but that his deeper instincts found profoundly unsettling. "Who are you?" he asked, though part of him was already beginning to suspect an answer that would challenge everything he thought he understood about his own history. "My name," the old man said, "is Marcus Vane. I'm your grandfather." The words hit Hollis like a physical blow. His grandfather had died when Hollis was 12 years old. He remembered the funeral, remembered grieving for a man who had been one of the most important influences in his childhood. Marcus Vane had been a forest ranger, a man who had taught young Hollis to read animal tracks, to understand weather patterns, to respect the natural world as a living system worthy of careful study and protection. "That's impossible," Hollis whispered. But even as he spoke the words, he was seeing resemblances that he had somehow missed during their time together in the repository. The shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw, the particular way of moving that spoke of decades spent in mountain terrain. "The man you knew as your grandfather did die," Marcus said gently. "But death, like many other concepts you've been taught to accept as absolute, is more negotiable than most people realize. When I accepted the responsibility of becoming a repository keeper, I was offered a choice: continue to age and die according to natural law, or accept a different kind of existence that would allow me to preserve important knowledge for as long as it was needed." The voices from the cave were getting closer, but Hollis found himself unable to move, stunned by revelations that recontextualized his entire understanding of his family history and his own journey to these mountains. "You knew I would come here," he said, the pieces beginning to fall into place. "You knew I would leave the army, knew I would choose these specific mountains to exile myself in?" "I hoped you would," Marcus admitted. "After the incident in Afghanistan, I could sense your guilt and your need to find some form of redemption. The repository has been watching over you for 20 years, subtly guiding your choices, ensuring that you develop the skills and the perspective you would need to eventually take on the responsibility of preserving this knowledge." The Chronicle of Keepers felt heavier against Hollis's back, weighted now not just with the responsibility of warning other repositories, but with the realization that his entire adult life had been shaped by forces he hadn't understood. His grandfather, somehow still alive after more than 50 years, had been orchestrating events to prepare him for this moment. "Why didn't you tell me who you were when I first arrived at the repository?" Hollis asked, struggling to process the emotional implications of discovering that someone he had grieved for decades was not only alive but had been watching over him from a distance. "Because you needed to choose this path freely," Marcus replied. "If you had known that your grandfather was the keeper of the repository, your decision to help preserve the knowledge would have been influenced by family loyalty rather than genuine commitment to the cause. The repositories require keepers who understand the true scope of what they're protecting." The sound of footsteps on stone echoed from the cave entrance, accompanied by the harsh beam of tactical flashlights. Their pursuers had reached the exit and would emerge onto the ledge within moments. "Time to go," Marcus said. But instead of moving toward the descent route, he turned back toward the cave entrance. "You need to reach the next repository and warn its keeper about what happened today. The Chronicle will guide you. Trust its wisdom, even when it seems to contradict your rational understanding of the world." "I'm not leaving you here," Hollis said, finally understanding what his grandfather intended to do. "You are," Marcus replied, with the gentle firmness that Hollis remembered from childhood. "Because this is bigger than either of us, and the knowledge must be preserved. The rationalist collective has been systematic in their destruction of the repositories, but they've never captured a keeper alive before. If I can convince them that I'm the only guardian of this knowledge network, it might buy you time to warn the others." The artifact that would define this moment of the story wasn't something physical that Hollis could carry with him. It was the revelation itself, the truth about his grandfather's survival, and the recognition that his entire life had been shaped by purposes larger than his personal guilt and redemption. The Chronicle of Keepers was important, but the real artifact was the knowledge of his own identity as part of a family legacy, dedicated to preserving wisdom for future generations. The first flashlight beams swept across the cave entrance as Hollis made the most difficult decision of his life. His grandfather's sacrifice would be meaningless if he allowed himself to be captured, along with the man who had spent more than 5 decades preserving ancient knowledge. With Juniper pressed close to his side, he began the treacherous descent down the rocky face toward the hidden valley, carrying the Chronicle of Keepers and the crushing weight of family revelations that had transformed his understanding of everything. The route down the cliff face was steep but navigable, carved into the rock by centuries of water flow and natural erosion. Handholds were plentiful, and the phosphorescent minerals that had guided them through the cave system continued to provide subtle illumination along the descent path. Behind them, voices echoed from the ledge as the Rationalist Collective's agents discovered Marcus standing alone at the cave exit. "Where is the other man?" a voice demanded, sharp with authority and barely controlled frustration. "What other man?" Marcus replied, his tone carrying the perfect blend of confusion and elderly bewilderment that might convince someone unfamiliar with his true nature that he was simply a confused hermit found in an unusual location. "Our monitoring equipment detected 2 human heat signatures entering the cave system," the voice continued. "You're going to tell us where your companion went, and you're going to explain how you gained access to the repository we've been tracking for the past 6 months." Hollis forced himself to continue descending, even as every instinct screamed at him to climb back up and help his grandfather face whatever interrogation was about to unfold. Juniper seemed to understand their predicament, moving with unusual care to avoid dislodging loose stones that might reveal their location to the people above. "Repository?" Marcus said, and Hollis could hear the genuine puzzlement in his voice. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about. I was exploring these caves when the storm started, looking for shelter. Are you with the Park Service?" The performance was masterful, but Hollis knew it couldn't last long. The agents had sophisticated equipment, detailed intelligence about the repository network, and the kind of resources that suggested government backing or substantial private funding. They wouldn't be fooled by an act of confused innocence for more than a few minutes. As he reached the valley floor, Hollis paused to study the Chronicle of Keepers more carefully. The ancient journal felt warm in his hands, and when he opened it, the pages seemed to glow with the same golden light that had illuminated the repository. Maps, diagrams, and handwritten notes filled every available space, creating a comprehensive guide to locations and contacts that spanned the entire Western Mountain region. The nearest repository, according to the Chronicle, was located approximately 15 miles northeast of their current position, hidden within what appeared to be an abandoned mining complex, in a valley that official maps showed as uninhabitable due to unstable geology. The entry described the keeper as Elena Vasquez, 3rd-generation guardian, specializing in botanical and agricultural knowledge preservation, but reaching Elena's repository would require crossing terrain that Hollis didn't recognize. Despite his decades of mountain experience, the maps in the Chronicle showed routes through areas that seemed to exist in the spaces between familiar landmarks, paths that connected hidden valleys and concealed passages through what he had always assumed was solid rock. Juniper stayed close as they began moving across the valley floor, her senses alert for any signs of pursuit from above. The snow here was deeper than it had been around the Redwood Grove, suggesting that this hidden valley received different weather patterns than the surrounding region. Pine trees grew in dense stands, their branches heavy with accumulated snow that muffled sound and created a sense of traveling through a vast, natural cathedral. Above them, the interrogation was becoming more intense. Voices carried clearly in the thin mountain air, and Hollis could hear the professional coldness of people trained to extract information through whatever means proved necessary. "We know you're more than just a lost hiker," one of the agents was saying. "Our intelligence indicates that you've been living in that tree structure for an extended period. You're going to explain how that's possible. And you're going to tell us about the other locations where similar installations exist." "I think there's been some kind of mistake," Marcus replied, but his voice was beginning to show strain. "I was just looking for shelter from the storm. I don't know anything about installations or other locations." The sound of equipment being moved suggested that the agents were setting up more sophisticated interrogation tools. Hollis forced himself to keep moving, knowing that his grandfather's sacrifice would be wasted if he allowed himself to be recaptured. But the emotional cost of abandoning family was almost unbearable, especially now that he understood the true scope of what Marcus had given up to preserve ancient knowledge. As they moved deeper into the hidden valley, Hollis began to notice signs that this place was not as untouched as it initially appeared. Game trails showed evidence of unusual patterns, as if animals moved through this area according to routes that served purposes beyond simple foraging and shelter-seeking. Plants grew in arrangements that seemed too systematic to be entirely natural, and certain trees bore markings that might have been random scarring but could equally well have been some form of communication system. The Chronicle of Keepers contained detailed notes about the relationship between repositories and their surrounding environments. According to Marcus's careful observations, accumulated over decades of study, the knowledge preservation sites existed in harmony with natural systems that had been subtly modified to provide protection and concealment. Animals, plants, geological features, and weather patterns all contributed to a complex defense network that made the repositories effectively invisible to casual observation. But the rationalist collective had developed methods for detecting these subtle modifications. Their monitoring equipment could apparently identify the energy signatures that distinguished protected areas from ordinary wilderness, allowing them to locate repositories that had remained hidden for centuries. As Hollis studied the Chronicle while walking, he began to understand the true scope of what was at stake. The network of repositories represented not just a collection of old books and artifacts, but a comprehensive alternative approach to understanding the relationship between human knowledge and natural systems. Everything from agricultural techniques that worked in harmony with local ecosystems to weather prediction methods based on animal behavior to healing practices that used locally available plants was documented and preserved within the scattered installations. The destruction of this network would represent a catastrophic loss of human cultural heritage, comparable to the burning of the Library of Alexandria, but spread across dozens of locations and encompassing knowledge traditions that stretched back thousands of years. From above, the sound of the interrogation had changed. Marcus's voice was no longer audible, replaced by the harsh tones of agents communicating with someone via radio equipment. The conversation was too distant to make out specific words, but the urgency in their voices suggested that they were coordinating with a larger operation. "Base, this is Team Alpha," one voice called clearly enough for Hollis to understand. "We have secured the primary target, but the secondary individual escaped into the valley system. Request immediate deployment of tracking assets to prevent compromise of additional sites." The implications were chilling. The attack on Marcus's repository hadn't been an isolated operation, but part of a coordinated campaign designed to roll up the entire knowledge preservation network. Other teams were probably moving against other repositories at this very moment, using intelligence gathered from previous raids to systematically eliminate the Guardians and destroy their collections. Hollis quickened his pace, urgency driving him forward despite the challenging terrain and his emotional exhaustion. Elena Vasquez needed to be warned about what was happening, and through her, word could be spread to other keepers throughout the region. The Chronicle of Keepers contained contact protocols and emergency communication methods that could potentially save lives and preserve at least some of the threatened knowledge. But as they approached the edge of the hidden valley, Hollis realized that reaching the next repository would require more than simply following the maps in the chronicle. The paths described in Marcus's notes seemed to exist in a different version of reality than the terrain he could see before him. To find Elena's installation, he would need to learn to perceive the landscape in ways that his rational, engineering-trained mind had never been taught to consider. The boundary between the hidden valley and the familiar world materialized as a shimmering distortion in the air, like heat waves rising from summer pavement but visible in the winter cold. Hollis had been following the Chronicle's directions for 3 hours, trusting Marcus's careful notations about landmarks and trail markers that existed only when viewed from the proper perspective. Now he stood before what appeared to be empty air, with Juniper whining softly beside him as she sensed something her human companion couldn't yet perceive. According to the Chronicle, crossing between the protected spaces required more than physical movement. It demanded a fundamental shift in how one understood the nature of reality itself. Marcus had written detailed instructions about the mental preparation necessary for transitioning between worlds. But reading about the process and actually experiencing it were proving to be vastly different challenges. "Trust what you cannot see," Hollis read aloud from the journal, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "The paths between repositories exist in the spaces where conventional perception fails. Allow your understanding to expand beyond the limitations of ordinary sight." The advice sounded like mystical nonsense to his engineer's mind, but everything about the past day had challenged his assumptions about what was possible. If doors could exist in living trees and rooms could be larger than their containers, then perhaps the landscape itself could be more flexible than he had ever imagined. He closed his eyes and tried to quiet the analytical part of his mind that insisted on cataloging and measuring everything he encountered. Instead, he focused on the feelings that had guided him through 20 years of mountain living, the intuitive sense of direction that helped him navigate in fog, the subtle awareness of weather changes that came through his skin rather than his instruments, the deep knowledge of seasonal rhythms that he had absorbed through daily observation rather than formal study. When he opened his eyes again, the world had changed. The shimmering distortion had resolved into a visible pathway that led through what his rational mind insisted was solid rock, but which now appeared as a natural archway opening into different terrain entirely. Beyond the threshold, he could see the abandoned mining complex that marked Elena Vasquez's repository, its weathered buildings nestled in a valley that definitely hadn't existed in this location. When he closed his eyes, Juniper had already moved through the archway, her tail wagging with the enthusiasm of a dog who had finally been allowed to follow a scent trail that had been calling to her for hours. She turned back to look at Hollis with an expression that seemed to ask why he was hesitating to follow her into obviously interesting territory. "Sometimes," he murmured to himself, "being rational means accepting that rationality has limits." He stepped through the archway. The sensation was like walking through cool water, despite the absence of any moisture. For a moment, his senses couldn't process the transition properly, and he experienced the disorienting feeling of existing in two places simultaneously. Then the effect passed, and he found himself standing in a valley under a sky that showed no signs of the storm that had been gathering. In the world he had just left, the mining complex ahead of them consisted of several wooden buildings in various states of repair, connected by paths that had been cleared of snow despite the apparent absence of any caretaker. Smoke rose from the chimney of the largest structure, and warm light glowed in its windows, creating the welcoming atmosphere of a home where someone was expecting visitors. But as they approached the main building, Hollis became aware of other presences in the valley, movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that seemed more purposeful than could be explained by wind-blown vegetation, and the subtle sense of being observed by multiple sets of eyes. The rationalist collective had either followed them through the reality shift or had arrived here through other means. The Chronicle of Keepers felt heavier against his back, weighted with the responsibility of warning Elena about the coordinated attack on the repository network. But as he studied the terrain around the mining complex, he realized that arriving ahead of the collective's agents might not be the advantage he had hoped for. If they were already in position around Elena's repository, his presence here might have led them directly to another target. Juniper's growl confirmed his suspicions. She had detected human scents that didn't belong to the repository's keeper, positioned in locations that suggested surveillance rather than casual presence. The agents had anticipated his destination and had arrived first, turning Elena's sanctuary into a trap designed to capture the one person who could warn the other repositories about the systematic assault on their network. From the main building, a figure emerged, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and the kind of practical clothing that spoke of someone who spent her days working with soil and growing things. Elena Vasquez moved with the calm confidence of someone on familiar ground, but her posture suggested awareness of the watchers hidden around her property. She had seen Hollis approaching and was walking out to meet him, but her route was deliberately taking her away from the buildings and toward a section of the valley where large boulders provided cover from observation. Whatever was about to happen, Elena had her own plans for dealing with the situation. Elena reached the cluster of boulders just as the first shots rang out across the valley. The Rationalist Collective's agents had abandoned stealth in favor of direct action, apparently concluding that capturing their targets alive was less important than preventing the repository network from receiving any warning about the coordinated attacks. Down! Elena shouted, diving behind the largest boulder as bullets chipped fragments from the stone around them. Juniper pressed herself against the ground beside Hollis, her ears flattened, but her eyes alert for any opportunity to help defend her pack. "You're Hollis Vane," Elena said. Not a question, but a statement of recognition. "Marcus sent word through the emergency protocols that you would be coming. I'm sorry about what happened to him." The confirmation that Marcus had been captured, or worse, hit Hollis like a physical blow, but he forced himself to focus on the immediate crisis. "How many agents are positioned around the complex?" he asked, his military training automatically assessing their tactical situation. 8 that I've identified," Elena replied, checking the loads in what appeared to be a well-maintained hunting rifle. "They arrived about an hour before you did, which suggests they have intelligence about the repository locations and the routes between them. Someone has been feeding them information from inside our network." The possibility of betrayal within the Keeper community added another layer of complexity to an already desperate situation. If the collective had access to detailed intelligence about repository locations, security procedures, and communication protocols, then warning the other Keepers might not be enough to save the knowledge preservation network. "What's our way out?" Hollis asked, studying the terrain around their position while bullets continued to crack overhead. "There isn't one," Elena said, with the calm resignation of someone who had accepted the likely outcome of their situation. "Not for both of us. But the knowledge must survive, even if we don't." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device that Hollis recognized as similar to the knowledge compass from Marcus's repository. This one was smaller and more portable, designed for field use rather than permanent installation. "This will guide you to the 3 remaining repositories that haven't been compromised," she explained, pressing the device into his hands. "The coordinates are encoded in the compass readings, and it will respond to your presence the same way Marcus's compass did. You have the Chronicle of Keepers, and now you have the means to navigate between the protected spaces without following established routes." The gunfire had stopped, suggesting that the agents were repositioning for a coordinated assault on their boulder shelter. In the silence that followed, Hollis could hear voices calling tactical instructions and the sound of equipment being moved into position. "There's something else you need to know," Elena continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The knowledge preserved in the repositories isn't just historical records and traditional techniques. Some of what we guard represents technologies and understanding that could fundamentally change how humanity relates to the natural world. The collective isn't just trying to destroy old books, they're trying to prevent the emergence of alternatives to the systems of power and control that currently dominate your civilization." The implications of this revelation transformed Hollis's understanding of the stakes involved in their struggle. If the repositories contained knowledge that could offer solutions to environmental degradation, sustainable approaches to energy and agriculture, or methods for living in harmony with natural systems, then their destruction represented more than cultural loss. It was an act of sabotage against humanity's future possibilities. "Go," Elena said, pointing toward a section of the valley where the terrain offered concealment, but also provided access to the reality boundary that would allow him to continue his mission. "I'll buy you as much time as I can. I'm not leaving you here to face this alone," Hollis protested, but Elena was already moving, using the boulder field as cover while she positioned herself to engage the advancing agents. "You are," she said firmly, "because this is bigger than any individual keeper. The knowledge must survive. That's what we swore to protect, no matter the personal cost." The portable knowledge compass in Hollis's hands began to pulse with warm light, its readings indicating a path through the valley that would lead him to safety and eventually to the next repository. But taking that path would mean abandoning Elena to face overwhelming odds with nothing but determination and a hunting rifle. From multiple positions around the valley, the agents began their final assault, moving with coordinated precision toward the boulder field. Muzzle flashes lit up the gathering dusk as Elena returned fire, her shots carefully aimed to slow their advance rather than simply create noise. "Go now," she shouted over the sound of gunfire. "While you still can." Hollis looked back once as he began moving toward the indicated escape route, carrying the Chronicle of Keepers, the portable compass, and the terrible weight of responsibility for preserving knowledge that could change the world. Behind him, Elena Vasquez continued to fight for time she would never live to see him use, her sacrifice joining Marcus's in the growing cost of keeping ancient wisdom alive in a world that seemed determined to destroy it. 6 months later, Hollis stood in a meadow high above the tree line, watching the sunrise paint the Sierra Nevada peaks in shades of gold and rose that reminded him of the light that had first drawn him to his grandfather's repository. Juniper lay beside him, her graying muzzle resting on her paws as she enjoyed the warmth of the early morning sun. The mountain silence was complete, except for the distant call of a red-tailed hawk riding the thermal currents that rose from the valleys below. The portable knowledge compass rested in his hands, its crystalline components glowing softly as they had every morning since Elena's sacrifice. The device had guided him to 17 repositories across 4 states, allowing him to warn their keepers about the Rationalist Collective's coordinated assault, and help them implement enhanced security measures that had so far prevented further losses, but the network would never be the same. Marcus and Eleanor were gone, along with 2 other keepers who had chosen to stand and fight rather than abandon their life's work to people who saw ancient wisdom as a threat to modern control. Their repositories had been destroyed, their collections scattered or burned, their accumulated knowledge lost forever except for the fragments that Hollis had managed to preserve in his expanded version of the Chronicle of Keepers. The journal had grown during his travels, filled with new maps, contact information, security protocols, and most importantly, copies of the most critical knowledge from repositories that were too exposed to remain in their original locations. He had become not just a messenger warning of danger, but a mobile repository himself, carrying essential information between communities of keepers who could no longer risk direct Communication, the transformative technologies that Elena had mentioned, proved to be even more significant than he had initially understood. Agricultural techniques that could restore degraded soil in a single growing season. Water purification methods that used locally available materials and required no external energy sources. Building designs that created comfortable living spaces while actually improving local ecosystems. All of this knowledge existed within the repository network, preserved by people who understood that humanity's survival might depend on remembering alternatives to destructive modern practices. But perhaps the most important discovery had been the realization that the knowledge itself was alive in ways that conventional science couldn't measure. The repositories didn't just contain information, they cultivated wisdom, allowing ancient understanding to evolve and adapt to contemporary challenges while maintaining its essential character. The keepers weren't simply librarians, but active participants in an ongoing conversation between human intelligence and natural systems that had been developing for thousands of years. Hollis had found his purpose in a way that finally allowed him to make peace with the guilt that had driven him into the mountains 20 years earlier. The bridge collapse in Afghanistan had been a failure of measurement and calculation, but his work with the repository network was teaching him that there were forms of knowledge that couldn't be quantified, relationships that existed beyond the reach of instruments and equations. His engineering background proved invaluable for understanding how ancient techniques could be adapted to modern conditions. But his real contribution was learning to think in ways that transcended the limitations of conventional scientific materialism. The rationalist collective had gone quiet after the initial wave of attacks, apparently satisfied with the damage they had inflicted and perhaps unaware of how quickly the surviving keepers had adapted their security measures. But Hollis knew they would be back, better prepared and more determined to eliminate what they saw as threats to rational thought and technological progress. The struggle between preservation and destruction would continue for as long as there were people who valued ancient wisdom and others who feared anything they couldn't control. From his position in the high meadow, Hollis could see 3 different valleys where repositories remained active, their locations invisible to casual observation, but clearly marked by the subtle patterns that he had learned to recognize. Each represented centuries of accumulated knowledge and the dedication of keepers, who had chosen to spend their lives in service to future generations. They would never meet. The portable knowledge compass pulsed once in his hands, indicating that new information was being transmitted through the network of connected devices. Somewhere, another keeper was sharing discoveries or requesting assistance with challenges that required collaborative solutions. The network was healing, adapting, growing stronger despite the losses it had suffered. Juniper stirred beside him, lifting her head to test the morning air with her nose. She had adapted to their new life of constant travel with the resilience of a dog who trusted her human to make good decisions about their shared adventures. In her simple presence, Hollis found daily reminders that loyalty, affection, and practical wisdom were sufficient foundations for a meaningful life, regardless of how complex the larger world might become. As they prepared to leave the meadow and continue their journey to the next repository on his route, Hollis reflected on how completely his understanding of the world had changed since that December morning when he had first seen a door glowing in the bark of an ancient redwood. He had come to the mountains seeking solitude and escape from responsibility, but had discovered instead a calling that connected him to something much larger than his personal failures and regrets. The mountains had taught him patience during his 20 years of exile. But the repositories had taught him purpose. The knowledge he now carried would outlive him, just as it had outlived Marcus and Elena and countless other keepers whose names were recorded only in the pages of journals like the one he carried. He had become part of a story that stretched back centuries and would continue for centuries more. ensuring that wisdom accumulated through careful observation and respectful relationship with the natural world would survive no matter what challenges the future might bring. The sunrise was complete. The meadow, fully illuminated by golden light that made every blade of grass seem to glow with its own inner fire. It was time to move on, to carry the knowledge forward, to continue the ancient work of preservation that had become his inheritance and his gift to generations yet to come.